Okay, I still got to get used to that intro there. It's so epic. I want to congratulate all the men whose wives or friends went to the women's retreat this weekend for surviving. I made it. I survived her being gone for about 24 hours, and I lived to tell the story. Because, I realize, I always say I'm the captain of my ship at home. I run everything. I run the vacuum, I run the dishwasher and all that. But I married an admiral, so I'm outranked. So I missed her being home. But I heard that God really moved in the women's retreat. And so for all the ladies that went this weekend, it was just a wonderful time. I know that God really spoke to you, and there's just a great time of bonding. And it's great to be a part of a family and a community where God is just drawing us together so that we can continue to reach out to people across the world. I'm so glad you're here today, and so glad you're with us on Daybreak Live. And I just happened to hear, just actually a couple minutes ago, I got a text that someone drove here all night from Knoxville, Tennessee. So I don't know where you are, who you are, but we want to welcome you. Can we welcome everyone on Daybreak Live and all of our guests today, just to say thank you for being here. Oh, I'm seeing a point over there. Okay. We're glad you guys are here. I'll try my best to keep you awake because it sounds like you've been driving all night. Is that right? Okay. All right. I'll do my best. So glad you're here. And we're talking about legendary. We're talking about what it means to live a life that's remembered for the right reasons. I mentioned last week that in this series, we're kind of taking a kind of a two-sided look at some different people in Scripture. So we spent the last couple weeks looking at one of the characters in the Bible named Solomon. Today we're going to take a first look at a man named Elijah. He was a prophet of God. He lived about 900 years before Jesus came to the earth, just to give you a little context. And in that story, of which he was a part, we follow the story of God's people, the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel, like any people group, had really great times where there were really high times and then really low times. And in these high times, we find that throughout the story, and that we find in scriptures, that people were doing the right things, they were being obedient, they were doing what they were supposed to do and living in God's blessing. And then there were other times when it wasn't so great. And they were being disobedient, and they were going their own way. And we see over and over that when that happened, that just led to their own self-destruction. That God says about himself in the Bible, he's a jealous God. And he's a jealous God because he's jealous for us for our own good. He's not jealous in a bad way. He's jealous in the most healthy of ways for his people. And so this is one of those darker times in the Bible that Elijah steps in, and in a very bold way, makes some very interesting and provocative statements about what was happening. And I just have to say again, I mentioned it last week, and it just continues to trouble me when I see or know people that start off so well, but they don't end well. And just after mentioning it last week and referencing some leaders in my own life, particularly one that I'm thinking over the last few months that had such a successful career and ministry throughout his whole life, and then just getting to the retirement stage of his life when all these things were uncovered about disobedience and scandal in his past. And having just freshly thought about that, just this week I got another text from a friend that said another leader that I'm colleagues with that happened to fall from a very, very high place. So we can just never be too careful. And I mentioned talking to you as men especially. Just being careful in the areas of your life to make sure that you have boundaries, to make sure your heart stays pure before God, to make sure that you're always just being humble and accountable in your life. It's just so important. And none of us are above what could happen to bring about a downfall in our life. So Elijah is a person that actually comes onto the scene, and we don't know a lot about him, but we have a reference to him in the New Testament in James, when James talks about him several hundred years later, and he says this, that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Elijah was a human being, even as we are, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it did not rain in the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. That gives you a good summary of the boldness of this man. We're going to talk about how bold it was that he actually would even pray this prayer. But that prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. And I want to say at the beginning, when you see the term, the adjective righteous, probably most of us would not describe ourselves that way. I know I wouldn't. I wouldn't say, oh yeah, I'm a righteous person. But I want us to understand the distinction between righteous and perfect. None of us are perfect. But if you're a follower of Jesus, God has actually made you righteous. And part of the problem that we have is we don't understand that. And so we're kind of in our mind, in our hearts, we're living in the past. We're thinking, oh, I'm just this terrible person that's always making mistakes. And we're always trying to be better. We're always trying to follow Jesus with a more pure heart. But we're not perfect. So he points out here, James says, he was a human being just like us, no different. So as we're introduced to him, it's, like I said, a very, very dark time. And you had all these kings of the nation of God, Israel, and we're introduced to one in 1 Kings chapter 16. His name was Ahab, and it says this: Ahab, the son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. See, he was the king. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebar, one of his predecessors, but he also married Jezebel. And since this has been written, it's been the least popular baby girl's name forever since. Has anybody ever met anyone named Jezebel? I know I haven't. He married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians, and he began to serve Baal and worship him. This was another false god that they worshiped there in that culture. So he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings before him. So this is our introduction to what's happening. The leader of God's people, the one who's supposed to be straight, the one who's supposed to be doing the right thing, is leading everyone astray. And this is when we're introduced to Elijah, and here's what it says. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Now, to go and say something like that was a very, very bold thing to say. In fact, it's hard for us to think of a parallel, but here's what we see from the very beginning is that Elijah was pursuing God's plan. Elijah wasn't pursuing what his own agenda was. Elijah was going before the king and saying something so bold, in fact, that he had to, after that meeting with Ahab, the king, he had to run for his life and live in exile for quite a long time because he put everything on the line to be able to say this bold thing to the king. He said, look, I know you don't want to hear this, but it's not going to rain for the next few years. Now, just try to picture what it's like to live in a place without water. Because for some of us, we have really no context for this proclamation. And having just come from a place in Liberia where water is much more scarce, much less accessible, I can tell you that it's much, much different way of life when you really don't know where your water is coming from. I remember the last night we stayed in Liberia, we were in this hotel, and we were all sharing rooms, and the filmmaker was with us. His name's Mike. He actually is working on the Justice Trail movie with me, and so we were sharing a room, and he says, hey, the water pressure is low in the shower, just so you know. Now, that was an understatement, because I went into the shower, and I turned it on, and nothing came out, and so I'm holding the little hose, and then I realized when I took the hose down to look at it, when I got it down to about here, a little trickle of water came out. So that was it. So my shower was like this, just with this trickle of water, doing the best I could. Water is a way of life for everyone. But for us, most of us, we've never experienced anything where we didn't have readily available water to us for whatever we wanted as much as we want. But for Elijah to say this, the best parallel that I can think of, because a drought was so disruptive to everyday life, everything you did was affected by what Elijah just proclaimed and began to pray, would be what happened at the beginning of COVID. Everybody just take a deep breath and sigh for a minute. I know that was a sad time. Go back to the beginning if you can remember. You remember what it was like? You remember watching the TV every day to see what the latest regulation or rule or stipulation was? You remember asking the question like, can I go to the store? Can I go to church? Can I drive in my car by myself? I remember some of those days driving on my own up 131 right here in Grand Rapids and seeing basically no one. And it was a surreal time. But I'm trying to imagine approaching someone of power. If I was a counselor to the president and I were to say to the president, look, I've prayed that our economy would totally shut down for the next few years until I say it's going to start again. How popular would that, how easy would that be to go before someone like the president and say something like that? This is exactly what Elijah did. And that's the opposite of what most of us would want to do. Most of us, when we're pursuing God's plan, we kind of bring our own thing into it, right? And we say, God, I want you to do this, and this is what I'm thinking. God, I'm thinking that if we could kind of do this together, then we could kind of see things grow and get bigger, and then we could expand, and we can do all this, and we just see everything going up and to the right. You know what I mean? But when have you ever prayed for something to go wrong? You ever done that? I was so convicted as I was thinking about this story this week because I can't think of very many times in my life where I prayed, God, I hope that things get harder. And I want you to make things harder for us. I want you to make things harder for me. But when you're pursuing God's plan, you're not pursuing your own plan. And so that's the question for us today is, what are we pursuing? Because what happens is, for some of us, we start pursuing God's plan. We're early on in this journey. And over the last about 6 weeks, we've had over 50 people give their lives to Christ for the first time. Let's celebrate that. A little louder. All right. So many of you, you're new on this, and so you're trying to figure it out, and you're going, okay, God's going to make my life better. And those of us that have been following Jesus for a long time, believe me, we have the same struggles. We're like, okay, I'm in this, but why aren't things getting better? I thought this was God's plan. I thought God loved me. I thought he had the best for me. But what we don't realize is when you go on that journey with God, sometimes things get tough. And then what do? And you know what I found? Is that when it gets difficult, it really centers you and makes you understand what you're really about, what your values really are, what you really care about. Because here Elijah is doing his best to pursue God's plan. And let me say this to you that are leaders in the room. You might be a leader in your business or in your home or in your community or in some facet of leadership. Sometimes you have to have the guts to say it's not always going to be up and to the right. That sometimes you have to stand before your people and you have to say, we might be heading for some tough times. Because that's leadership. That's what Elijah did here. And I can't help but think of the position that I'm in this group of prayer leaders around the country. As we meet and we connect every year, in a couple weeks, many of us will be in Washington, D.C. for the National Day of Prayer. And as I stand before them, as I was thinking about this, and I'm just going to be real with you. As I was reading this week, I know that one of the things that has been so prevalent over the years of this coalition of leaders that are praying for America has been praying, God, send revival to America. And what that means is, God, just bring a renewal to the faith, the Christian faith in America. And we've been praying that. I mean, long before I was in there, for 40 years as this ministry has continued on. But what would it be like for me to stand in front of those leaders and say, you know, we're headed for some tough times. Things are going to get difficult. Those aren't easy things to say. And some of you, maybe you're sensing that, and God is nudging you as leaders, and you have to be willing to say the tough things like Elijah did, to pursue God's plan. So that leads us to one of the most infamous stories in the Bible, and I'm going to read through the whole thing. So stick with me here. So Elijah gets together the people, and he says, listen, it's time for a showdown between Baal, this god that Ahab is serving, and the true God. And so this is what happens. So Elijah, he said to them, I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets, so get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood and set fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and I will put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people said, what you say is good. Now keep in mind that Elijah's speech here is to the people of Israel, the ones that are kind of wavering about who to serve and what to do. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. And call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given to them, and they prepared it. And then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. There's no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar that they had made. Now at noon, Elijah begins to get a little cocky here. And he says to them, he begins to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. And I just need you to know that that term busy in thought is actually a euphemism, which means he's basically saying, hey, maybe he's in the John. Maybe he's relieving himself. Elijah's getting pretty real here. Maybe he is sleeping. He must be awakened. And so they shouted louder and louder, and they slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until the blood flowed. And midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response, no one answered, and no one paid attention. And then Elijah said to the people, come here to me. And they came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. And Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With those stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. And he arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said, and they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered. And they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down the altar and even filled the trench around that altar. So at the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed. Now listen to his prayer. This is so important. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. His prayer was for God to be God and for the people to see that it was all about God. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. And when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and they cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. This all was centered around a prayer that Elijah was praying for God's people. And of all the things we could talk about in this story. This is one of the most limitless stories that we could find in the Bible. We could talk about so many different things, and I want to just focus on one thing, and that is how Elijah's prayer really tied into this whole event. Because the question that we often ask ourselves is, why do we have to pray for something if God already wants to do it? Why did I have to pray for us to become pregnant when God could have just done it himself? Why did I have to pray for this job when God just could have given it to me? Why did I have to pray for this situation or this person when God just could have done it? And the questions, many of them are answered in what we just read, because here Elijah goes before the people and he creates this showdown. I mean, you talk about the boldness of a guy to do this, and he starts taunting these prophets, making fun of their God. Something that really wouldn't be super politically correct to do these days, right? Elijah's just out there and he's being real, and he's going, look, if this is real, let's see something. And he puts God on display. But notice what his prayer was. His prayer was for the people. His prayer could have been, God, get me out of this. I mean, I put myself in this situation, and I got 450 men that are angry at me now, and so you better come through or I'm not going to live. He could have easily prayed that prayer, a self-preservation prayer, a survival prayer. But his prayer was for the people. His prayer was that God would know them. He said, I'm praying this so that they would know. And I think there's something here for us. As these people are serving these other gods, these gods that they're looking at for hope and answers and faith, and we can get caught up in the same things. We can believe that technology has the answers, that clothes can change our identity, that money and materialism can truly meet our deepest needs, that relationships with other people are what we need. But all those things alone are just false gods. It's idolatry. It's us giving our lives to something, believing that that's where really the answers and the hope lie, instead of giving it to God. Instead of saying, God, you're the answer. You're my hope. You have everything I need. The relationships in my life that don't seem to fill the void, the materialism that doesn't seem to fill the void, the only thing I know that can fill it is you. The number one issue in our world is loneliness. People are looking for relationships, and the ultimate relationship where everything becomes fulfilled is when that relationship begins vertically with God. Elijah here is saying, God, come through for your people. It reminds me of how I pray. I'm so convicted. You know, and I found early in my journey of faith as I prayed, so much of my prayer was centered around myself. I found this to be true in our relationships. There's kind of a continuum where we enter into a relationship, and all the hundreds of couples that we've done premarital counseling and premarital counseling classes that Ari and I have done for years, we would always start off by saying that relationships begin with attraction. There's an attraction that happens. Sometimes it's a personality attraction. Sometimes it's a physical attraction. For me, it began with Ariana with a physical attraction. For her, not so much. But that's another story. Why are you laughing? Is that fun? But it begins with attraction. But if it just stays there, if it just stays in that attraction mode, and one day you look at him and you go, I'm not just attracted to him anymore. We've all been in relationships like that, and you go, well, that's over. It's shallow. It's just a starting point. But in our relationship with others, but our relationship with God, we enter into it with very selfish motives. We don't realize at the time, and it's okay. But if we stay there, we're in an unhealthy place. But as we take steps of faith in our life, and as relationships in our life get deeper, what happens is we start thinking more and more about the other person. And what happens is we get to this line somewhere where it's like a tipping point, where all of a sudden we step over that line in that relationship, and things change where it's so much more beautiful because it's really centered more on that other person's needs and not our own. And let me tell you, marriage at its best is when you can get into that zone. It's amazing. It's amazing when you may not feel an attraction to someone, but you're in love with them on such a deeper level. And that's the same thing that happens with God. And so as we begin to pray, if you're early on in your journey, you go, I pray and nothing happens, I don't get it. I just want you to know that when you pray more of a self-centered prayer, it's fuzzy, it's hard. There's mixed motives happening there. There's a conflict of interest because sometimes we're always just saying, God, I want you to do this for me. Now, does God want to bless us? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. Does God love us? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. Is God for us? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. He's for us and he loves us and all that. But why isn't it that God's answering these prayers? Well, if you're a parent and you know that every time your kid asks for you something and you say yes, what kind of kid are you going to have? B-R-A-T. And so what we learn as we begin to pray is that I think it just happens subtly. We also all of a sudden start realizing that we're praying for other people more than maybe we're praying for ourselves. What a novel thought. Then all of a sudden we're going, well, man, this person's having so many issues, and your heart goes out for them, and you start thinking about them, and you stop thinking about yourself. You know, it's the same way with your relationship with Daybreak, by the way. Some of you are brand new in the journey, and we want to do everything we can to provide every need that you have. But let me tell you, if you just stay there, and all of a sudden you show up and you're like, well, Jeff wasn't as good this week, or I didn't like the kids' ministry this week, and it's all about you, and you stay there forever, it's never going to be good enough for you. But if you can continue on and just grow and learn that it's not really just about you, you'll find such a more deep and beautiful and meaningful relationship with this church if you can learn that lesson. Elijah here is praying for God's people. He's praying beyond himself. Listen to what Hebrews 4 says. Let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace and help us in our time of need. There's so much I could say about that. When we go before God's throne, it's such an amazing opportunity. The person that I stepped in the leadership role nationally for the National Day of Prayer, his name was Dave. He passed away. He led for 20 years in the role, and he had one of the greatest teachings on this passage. I have to give him credit today. He's no longer here, but maybe he's listening. And he talked about this idea of God's throne and what it would be like to go in the throne room. And I can't do it as good as he does. But I love how Dave described that throne room. The Bible gives us some insight. I believe it's a literal place. The Bible describes this throne room. Imagine walking into the most majestic room you've ever seen in your life. And being over in some of the ancient places of Europe, we just don't really have things like that here in the States because we're still so new as a country. But over in Europe, you find these very ornate buildings that are marble and gold and carved and just hundreds of years of work. And I just try to imagine what it would be like to go in the throne room of God, and imagine that you go in there and you hear the angels singing and you hear this angel choir with a roar of sound of worship that you can't even fathom. It's deafening to your ears, and you go in there in the mighty and holy presence of God. And when you go in before God's throne room and you're praying, you have access to go into that room. You know, we can't just walk into the White House and the Oval Office. Man, there's checkpoints, you got to be invited, you got to do the background checks, all this stuff. Just imagine walking in to the throne room. And you're going there because you're seeking God's heart in prayer for something in your life. And imagine walking it almost like there's a back door. Dave describes just imagine you could kind of come in the back door and you could walk in the midst of all that, and everyone sees you and everything stops for your moment. And you say, God, thank you for this food, amen. And you walk out. For some of us, that's the extent of what happens. But just imagine a different level where you can go before the throne of God. Wow. There's so much there. So Elijah was praying for God's people. Well, he's triumphant. God shows up. He works on behalf of his people, and then it goes on to say this. So Elijah said to Ahab, "Go eat and drink, for there is a sound of heavy rain." Now remember, it had not rained at this point for 3.5 years, and Elijah said, "Now is the time." The people have turned their hearts to God, and they're believing, and so it's going to rain. He proclaims it. And so Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed up to the top of Mount Carmel. He bent down to the ground, and he put his face between his knees. And he said, "Go and look towards the sea," he told the servant. And he went up and he looked, and there's nothing there, he said. He was having him check for the rain. 7 times Elijah said, "Go back." So the servant would go and look. No rain, come back. To Elijah. Didn't see anything. Go back again. 2nd time, 3rd time, 4th time, 5th time, 6th time. Elijah, still in his boldness, still in his faith, still in his assurance of what God was going to do, he said, "Go check the 7th time." 7th time the servant replied, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." And Elijah said, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, and the wind rose, and a heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. And the power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he put on his hokas, and he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Wow! Elijah persisted for God's purpose. He did something really interesting. It says that he crouched down to the ground, and he put his head between his knees, and he began to pray. Now, for us, that may seem kind of odd, but it was actually kind of symbolic, what Elijah was doing at that moment. What Elijah was doing is he put himself in the position of a woman about to give birth. This is how women would give birth. They were tough. They would just crouch down and kind of put their head between their knees until they gave birth. And that's exactly what Elijah was doing. Elijah put himself in a position where it's like, I'm going to give birth to this thing. I'm going to persevere. I'm going to persist until I see it happen. So many times, that's really where it gets real. As how long are we going to stick this thing out? How long are we going to labor for this thing, pun intended, until it gives birth to what God wants to do? How long are we going to put ourselves in a position where we're just going to be there and we're going to gut it out until we see God do it? And you may say, why does God want to do that? Why wouldn't he just do it? I'll tell you this. There's something you gain in the process of that persistence. There's something that God builds within your heart. There's something that God does within your soul to strengthen your resolve to know that God is real, that God is going to do it. That even as I look at the world now and it doesn't make sense, and even as I look at my situation now that seems impossible, and I think there's nothing that can happen because I've been praying and asking God to do this for years, and I don't see anything. I'm telling you, if you persist, God will move. If you persist, God will move. The ending to this particular story is actually kind of comical to me because he says to his servant, go tell Ahab, jump on your chariot and take off. And in our prayer partners this morning, Tim was telling us, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, that the journey that they were going on, Ahab and Elijah, was a 32-mile distance. And so here's Elijah looking down and seeing a man just blazing on a chariot. And I just imagine maybe the servant standing there on the mountain and getting the view and watching this chariot go and watching a man just blow right by. Ahab and his hokas making it happen. Actually, he just had the sandals, the cloak tucked in, burning it for 32 miles after all he did. There's a man named Dean Karnazes. And there's kind of an infamous story about this guy. Dean Karnazes, on his 30th birthday, he was out at a bar with some friends, and he decided, on my 30th birthday, I want to run 30 miles. This was after working all day, and he had like work loafers on. And everyone thought he had a few too many, and he was just kind of talking crazy. He goes, you know what? I'm going to go and I'm going to run 30 miles. And he leaves the bar, and he runs for 30 miles in loafers on his 30th birthday, just like that. And Dean Karnazes is one of those interesting case studies because in his body, what normally stops a runner is the buildup of lactic acid in the muscles, among some other things which cause fatigue. But in studying Dean Karnazes, they found that his lactic acid builds to a certain level and then it just starts to slowly decline, meaning that this man can literally run forever. He's just kind of one of those unique guys. I want to remind you of something today, that when the power of the Lord comes on you, you can do things you wouldn't normally do. You get into the supernatural. You get into the things that are unexplainable. You get into things where people look at you and go, it doesn't make sense why this would happen, and why would this person do this or get this, or what are the results? When you begin to step into a place where the power of God comes on you and you persist, I'm telling you, your life will change, because all of a sudden you step into the supernatural. You step into a place where God is the only explanation for something happening. And I don't know about you, but that's where I want to be. That's where I want to live my life. I want to live my life where people look and go, it doesn't make sense. I don't know how this works. I don't know how it happens. But with the heart of Elijah, say, it's not about me. It's all about the love of God. When your heart's focused on the love of God, when your heart is focused on Him getting the credit and Him getting the glory, the supernatural will occur in your life. The power of God will come on you, and things will start to happen that no one can explain, not even you. May it be so. May we live lives that are legendary. I want you to stand with me today. If you're struggling today, if you've given up, if it's just seemed too impossible, too hard, I want to pray for you today, that God would show you that all things are possible when He's in it, if you trust Him. If you're hanging on by a thread today, you just need to know that God is waiting to break through. Maybe you just haven't been in the right position yet. Maybe your heart's not quite ready yet. But trust me, He's working on your behalf. Bow your heads with me. So, Father, today I thank you. I thank you for what this story has said to us today, happening about 3,000 years ago, and yet this story rings true in our hearts because we face things today that we can't understand. Lord, for those that are struggling today, that just can't seem to figure out what's next, they just can't seem to hang on for another day. They've lost hope. Lord, I pray you'd fill them with your hope today. For some that are just ready for that breakthrough that's almost ready to happen, may the Spirit of God come on them, just like what happened to Elijah, and the unexplainable, the impossible begins to happen, so that indeed our lives will be remembered as legendary. In Jesus' name, amen. It's been so great to be with you today. God bless.